All right, Jefferson and the Louisiana Purchase. So the election of 1800 was called the Revolution of 1800 because there was no fighting. The Federalists, led by John Adams, had lost the election of 1800. Jefferson and many of his Democratic Republican friends had won their battle, both to be president and members of Congress. Once the Federalists lost power, they simply left the Capitol and let Jefferson move into the president's mansion and let the Democratic Republican congressmen take their seats in Congress. There was no fighting, so really it was a peaceful transfer of political power, which up until this point in the world was very rare. And Americans have continued to have a peaceful transfer of power for over 220 years. Jefferson becomes very popular very quickly by cutting the size of the government, which means there'd be less taxes on it. You would need less taxes. And because you need less taxes, Jefferson also fired all the internal tax collectors, all the tax collectors that were going around inside the United States collecting things like taxes on whiskey, the excise tax, which of course farmers didn't like. So all these items made him extremely popular. But quickly after taking office, he heard a rumor, and the rumor was quickly spreading from the West, that is, the Americans living in what we now know as the Ohio River Valley area, to the East, and that rumor concerned the port of New Orleans. So the rumor was that the Spanish were going to stop the American farmers from using the port of New Orleans, which would have been a disaster for the Western farmers of America. So most farmers west of the Appalachian Mountains used the Mississippi River as a highway, so to speak, to reach the port of New Orleans. So farmers out west basically grew their crops. They put them on flat bottom boats, basically rafts, and they floated them down to New Orleans, where they would take their crops off the rafts, store them in a building for safety until a big sailing ship came along, put those crops in a sailing ship, and the sailing ship could then quickly move out in the Gulf and the Atlantic and take those crops to the major cities along the East Coast, New York and Philadelphia, and even as far as Europe to sell. So if the port of New Orleans is going to be closed, it's going to be a disaster for the American economy, especially the American farmers out west. And remember, Thomas Jefferson, the Democratic Republican Party, basically represents the farmers of America. Now, of course, many rumors that you hear are not true. This one happened to be true. And again, the Mississippi River was so important, but so was the port of New Orleans. But the port of New Orleans was now under Spanish control and not American control. And so if this rumor was true, which it was, again, the American economy would be severely affected, as all those former farmers out west would basically be bankrupt. So the whole reasoning behind closing the port of New Orleans actually involved the French. So at the time, the French in Europe, of course, were fighting many other nations in Europe after the French Revolution, after the French king had lost his head. Napoleon Bonaparte had risen to power. The nations around France had tried to go into France and put down the rebellion and restore the kingship, but the French had fought back. So basically these wars were going in Europe called the Napoleonic Wars. And Napoleon was not just interested in basically taking over European countries. Really, Napoleon had sort of a really grand plan, basically to rule the world. first by taking over Europe, but then taking over parts of Africa, and by having colonies around the world. He would basically control the world. Now, of course, to rule the world, to control the world, the French would need a big army. So Napoleon needed a really big army so he could rule the world. But armies cost money. So in order to have big armies to rule the world, the French, Napoleon, were going to need a lot of money. So they needed a lot of money to have a really big army so they could rule the world. And when Napoleon thought about how to make that money, he immediately thought about sugar. Now, I know today, when you think about how to make money, you probably don't think of sugar. But back in the day, back in the 1800s, sugar was a big money maker. You know, for most of people's history, for most of mankind's history, there was no artificial sweetener available. And, you know, you were lucky if you had some sweet-tasting fruits or maybe some honey. But then, of course, people sort of discovered sugarcane, and that became very profitable because from the sugarcane you could make granular sugar, and of course sweeten many products. And people around the world quickly, you know, had a sweet tooth, so to speak, and they needed sugar, wanted sugar at least. And if Napoleon could grow a lot of sugar, he could make a lot of money, which means he'd have a really big army, which means he could conquer the world. And where was he going to grow that sugar? Well, down in the Caribbean, on the island of Hispaniola, which means Little Spain, which is one of the islands Christopher Columbus had stumbled upon when he first came over in 1492. But by this time, part of that island was actually French. Santo Domingo, which is now basically called Haiti, was the French part of the island. So Napoleon's plan was to basically plant the entire island, at least his part of the island, basically that entire area full of sugar cane, to grow the sugar, to get the money, to get the army, to conquer the world. Of course, he's going to have a lot of workers. And since there are already slaves on the island, he would have a lot of slaves growing a lot of sugar to make a lot of money, to have a big army, to conquer the world. But if your entire island is planted in sugarcane, you're going to have someplace else to grow food to feed the people that are growing the sugarcane, whether they be slaves or free laborers. Those people just can't have a diet of sugarcane. They're going to need, you know, a balanced meal. They're going to need some protein. They're going to need a diet that will, you know, help them be big and strong so they can, you know, grow that sugar to get that money, to get those armies to conquer the world. So where was Napoleon going to grow that sugar? Simple. He was going to grow it in Louisiana, which had once been a French possession. Name Louisiana comes from King Louis of France. And so basically, Louisiana was just going to be one big farm. And he's going to grow all that food in Louisiana to feed all those workers in Haiti, in Santo Domingo, to grow all that sugar, to make all that money, to have all that big army, to conquer the world. It was a great plan. First of all, the only problem was he didn't have Louisiana anymore. After the French and Indian War, with the French lost New France, of course, part of New France had gone to the British. The part on the eastern side of the Mississippi River had gone to the British and eventually had been taken over by the Americans when they became independent. The other part of New France on the western side of the Mississippi River had been given to Spain because Spain had helped France fight the war, the World War in 1763. And so since 1763, Louisiana had been Spanish. So the first thing Napoleon had to do was get Louisiana back so he could make it into a big farm, so he could feed all the people on Hispaniola, so he could grow all the sugar, so he could sell all the sugar, so he could make all the money, so he could have a big army to conquer the world. So basically he goes to Spain, well, he sends someone to Spain and says, hey, your friend Napoleon here, can we have Louisiana back, please? And what do you think the Spanish said? That's right, probably you and I would say no. The Spanish said yes, for several reasons. First of all, Louisiana was a really big place, and there were very few Spaniards there. There were a few Spaniards in New Orleans, and a few Spanish along the river, Mississippi River, but otherwise, there weren't any Spanish there. The rest of the area was occupied by Indians. But the Indians were not really friendly Indians. In fact, the Indians seemed to be very hostile. In fact, it seemed that the Indians' favorite hobby was actually shooting arrows into the Spanish. So the Spanish had to defend this huge area against all these hostile tribes of Indians, which cost them a lot of money. And their defenses were such, the Spanish didn't have many forts in the area, was such that, for example, if a nation like, I don't know, the United States wanted to invade Louisiana, they might do that and be able to take it over for free. So the Spanish figured, this is costing us money and it might be easily taken over, so why can't we get rid of it? Why can't we sell it and make some money off of it before someone takes it over for free? Besides which, the French were going to offer the Spanish something for this, Louisiana. And really, the Spanish never really wanted Louisiana except for one reason, and that was to keep those Americans out. First the British and then the Americans. The Spanish never trusted those people. They never trusted the British. They never trusted those Americans. For some reason, the Spanish believed, those crazy Americans, would move across the continent and take over places like Texas and Spanish Texas and Spanish California. Now, can you believe that? Oh, wait, that happened. So the Spanish had reason to be concerned about American Western movement. So really, they just wanted Louisiana as a buffer zone. So when Napoleon offers to trade a part of Europe for Louisiana, the Spanish are thrilled. Basically, Napoleon is going to give them part of northern Italy, a place called Tuscany, which had 1 million tax-paying citizens, none of which had a bow and arrow. And the Spanish were thinking, wow, this area in northern Italy, this can make us rich. And then, once the French get Louisiana back, they're going to be stationing an army there. And in 1800, this French army was the best in the world. They were the finest army in the world. So if the French army had come to Louisiana, there's no way a third-rate little nation like the United States would ever break through the French army. And that means the Spanish territories of Texas and other places would be safe. So now the Spanish think it over. I mean, this is a great deal, actually. They're going to trade a territory that they didn't want and is costing them money to have to a nation that's going to take it over and make sure that the United States never takes over any more Spanish territory. So in 1800, the Spanish agreed to hand over Louisiana to the French. So Napoleon's plan is coming to play out. Pretty soon he'll have Louisiana. He'll be growing the food there. He'll be sending the food to Hispaniola, and there'll be all those people will be fed and growing his sugar cane, and he'll be selling the sugar cane or sugar and getting rich and having big armies and conquering the world. But then another little problem arose. Just about the time he gets Louisiana back, he loses Santo Domingo. He loses what we now know as Haiti. He loses basically the island of Hispaniola because there's a slave uprising. So when the French had their French Revolution in 1789 and rose up against their king, the slaves in Santo Domingo said, wow, look at those Frenchmen. They're rising up and getting their freedom against their mean rulers. Why don't we do that? So there had been a slave rebellion on the island. On the island that France wanted as a sugar colony. So they'd gotten Louisiana because that's going to be their grain house. Louisiana's going to be the place they feed their wonderful people on the island to feed their sugar colony. But now they have to get their sugar colony back. And so Napoleon says, no problem, I'll just send over an army and take it back. This French sent over a 30,000 man army under the command of Napoleon's brother-in-law, General Leclerc. And the French land on the island, and within just a month or so, had basically taken over all the cities. It looked like things were going pretty well. And then two things happened. One, the slaves fought back really hard, led by a guy named Toussaint Louverture, who's pictured here, who had actually sort of led the slave revolt in the first place. The slaves fought very hard, and even when the slaves were captured, they would like kill themselves rather than go back into slavery. And the French were having a hard time, and at this point, Leclerc sends a white flag out and says, hey, Leclerc, why don't you come into camp under a flag of truce, and we'll talk about this. Maybe we can end this a little fight in a way that we can both be satisfied. So Louverture goes in the French camp under a flag of truce, and Leclerc immediately arrests him, throws him in chains, puts him on a ship, and sends him back to France, where they put him in a prison, and he dies. So now basically the former slaves are a little bit disorganized, and now these French start to make headway in taking over the island. But then an even greater army attacks them, a bigger army, an army of millions. Mosquitoes. But the mosquitoes are carrying a disease called yellow fever. And when the mosquito bites you and it transfers this disease into your bloodstream, it starts to shut down your organs, for example, your kidney. And of course, the kidney is one of the places in your body that takes the waste in your body and basically refines it and basically separates the waste from the useful parts that basically go back in the bloodstream. So once the kidney's attacked, basically the people start to turn a yellowish color. Their skin becomes inelastic. It becomes sort of like plastic, and their skin turns really yellow, and then their body parts start to turn to mush, and then they die a terrible, horrible death. So within just a couple of months of the 30,000 man army that had been sent over 20,000 of them died yellow fever. And together with the resistance by the former slaves, pretty soon Leclerc is down to like 5,000 men. And Leclerc then writes back to his brother-in-law in France, Napoleon, and says, look, Napoleon, we can take this island. To take this island, to take our part of the island back, we will need 12,000 troops that are immune to yellow fever. Now, to get 12,000 troops to be immune to yellow fever, Napoleon, you need to send over an army of 82,000 men. Because when the 82,000 men get here, every one of them will get yellow fever. 70,000 of them will die, but the good news is 12,000 of them will recover and be able to take over the island. A few days later, Leclerc dropped dead of yellow fever himself. So when Napoleon gets the message, first of all, he's sort of heartbroken, because his brother-in-law died, bummer. But even worse, because he really doesn't have an extra army to send over. Napoleon's about to start another war in Europe, and he needs every soldier he can get. So he doesn't have extra 82,000 men just to send over to take back the sugar colony. So that plan of world domination, he goes, oh, forget it. I'll find some other way to conquer the world. Those people, those former slaves, can have that island. I don't care. And if you don't need the island anymore to grow sugar, you won't need Louisiana. And it's just about this time that Jefferson sends over some negotiators to offer Napoleon some money for New Orleans. Because New Orleans is so vital to the American economy, even though it's not American, the ambassadors from Jefferson have been authorized to spend $10 million for New Orleans and a little strip to the land east of it. Now, to put that in perspective, the entire U.S. budget in 1803, the entire U.S. national expenditures were $8 million. And so this was like more than the United States spent in a year, the U.S. government spent a year. And by the way, the U.S. government expenditures today are like several $1 trillion in a year. So that gives you an idea of how much they're actually spending. So in today's term, you could break this down by trying to figure out how much interest you would earn on your money over the years. But in reality, if you're spending basically your national budget on this, your one-year national budget, if you look at what the United States national budget is today, you can probably sort of estimate it was a really big sum of money. So basically the United States wanted just New Orleans and a little sliver of land to the west of it, what we call West Florida, which is basically where sort of the coastal strip is of Mississippi and Alabama is today. And the United States was willing to pay, again, $10 million, which again was a great deal of money at the time, just for New Orleans, a little strip of land west of it. That's how important New Orleans was to the American economy. But when the Americans arrive, they're surprised, and Napoleon offers a counteroffer. Instead of spending $10 million for New Orleans and a little strip of the land west of it, he will give you New Orleans and everything to the west of it for $15 million. So the French wanted $15 million for New Orleans and everything to the west of it. And of course, everything to the west of it is like really, really big. It's not a little piece of land, it's a huge piece of land. So basically, you can see basically what he was selling on this map of the United States. You can see all the different states that would come about as a result of the Louisiana Purchase. But actually, it's even more because no one actually knew exactly the boundaries of the Louisiana Purchase. Oh, everyone knew that it started at the Mississippi River, but no one knew how far north it went. No one knew how far west it went. So, you know, who knows? It might go into Canada. It might go all the way to the Pacific Ocean. It might include Texas. And you're getting this for $15 million or 3 cents an acre. Now, there's a deal you don't get any time these days, 3 cents an acre. Now, the American delegates in France don't have permission to spend $15 million. Sure, they can write a letter back to Jefferson. They can put it on a ship. That ship will probably take a month at least to get to America. Then their answer will come back in a month, maybe. So you're talking maybe 2 months, maybe 3 or 4 months. Napoleon can change his mind at any moment. So the American delegate said, sure, we'll give you $15 million. So they sign an agreement hoping that the president okays it when he sees it. But Jefferson sort of in a quandary because Jefferson has a strict interpretation of the Constitution. And nowhere in the Constitution does it say that you can buy land for the United States. So for all these years, since Jefferson's been George Washington's Secretary of State and all this other, ever since the new Constitution had been written, Jefferson has been saying strict interpretation, strict interpretation, strict interpretation. You can only do what's written in the Constitution. So what's he going to do? Oh, sure, I guess you could ask Congress to write up an amendment to the Constitution that says you can buy land, send it around to the states, get 3/4 of the states to ratify it. That could take a year, 2 years, 3 years, and Napoleon could change his mind at any moment. So again, Jefferson's, what's he going to do? Strict interpretation. I have to strict interpretation. But what a great deal. What a great deal. But strict interpretation, I can't do it. It's strict interpretation. But what an awesome deal. 3 cents an acre, doubles the size of the United States overnight. Oh, but I can't do it. Strict interpretation. But it's such an awesome deal. Strict interpretation. Wait. Oh, I'm sorry. Jefferson said, did you think I said strict interpretation all these years? No, you misunderstood me. I never said strict interpretation. You people must have a hearing problem. We're taking the deal. So the deal was so good, Jefferson changed his mind on his strict interpretation. And quickly, of course, Congress approved the deal. And in 1803, the United States bought Louisiana for $15 million. And today, of course, as you saw, it encompasses parts of many states that have been created out of the Louisiana Purchase area. Of course, Napoleon needed the $15 million to start the war, but he was also hoping for other things. Because his war in Europe was against England, for example, he was hoping that maybe that Louisiana border, how far did it go north? I mean, did it go all the way into British Canada? Did it go all the way across to what we now know as Oregon, which the British claimed? And if the Americans claimed that land based on Louisiana Purchase, wouldn't that involve them in a war against England? So maybe he was hoping to get us involved in a war against England so he'd have an easier time conquering Europe. Of course, how far west did it go? Did it involve, Texas, California? If that was the claim, if America was going to claim Texas and California based on this, that would involve us in a war against Spain. That would be good for Napoleon too, and make them, make Spain easier to take over in Europe. But even if none of that happened, by selling Louisiana to the United States, I'm sure he was also hoping that we would use this to our advantage and grow bigger as a nation and stronger, and perhaps in a few years be equal with England, which is a country that, of course, Napoleon didn't like at all. So it's not exactly like he sold the land because he loved the United States. He sold the land, one, because he needed the money, but also he was sort of hoping that this would work to his benefit later on. But for the United States, it was a great deal. And as we'll see, we'll have to find out exactly what we bought. Sure, they're Indians, but what sort of Indians? Where are they? Are there some natural resources in there that we could find and use and sell? What's really there? So Jefferson will authorize an expedition, a group of people to go explore this area to see what we actually bought. And that expedition will be headed by Lewis and Clark. But nevertheless, a great buy to the United States, the Louisiana Purchase.